Okay, well, kia ora koutou. He iri ahau no Ngāti Maniapoto, ko Awanui Te Huia ahau, ko hau te tei o ngā kaimahi ki te Kawa Māui, ki Te Herenga Waka, ki Wiki. Kia ora everybody, my name's Awanui. I am a senior lecturer at Te Kawa Māui, and I'll be talking about the importance of understanding history when we are trying to work through our revitalisation of Tidal Maori. Okay, ka pai. Yep, sorry, I was just checking the chat there. Okay, so as I talk, feel free to chuck some questions in the chat, and once we close up, I'll have a go at trying to answer some of those questions. But if something's top of mind, feel free not to have to wait till the end. So I mean, this is just a little bit of context. So these are our most recent health of the language sort of results that we've got, or Stats New Zealand results. And what we can see is that, these ones are sort of measuring lower levels of proficiency. So these are the people who can speak more than a few words or phrases in Te Reo Māori. And so, I suppose, that's a positive thing in some respects. So we've got younger people being able to say a few more words and a few more phrases in Te Reo Māori. Whether that's sort of a strong indication of where we're at in terms of the language. So what we need for Te Reo Māori to be a functional language of this country is for us to be able to use Te Reo Māori across a range of contexts to explain our everyday lives, right? So while it's cool that we can all say a little bit here and there, we need to be sort of striving for higher goals, higher aspirations. And so when we think about sort of some older stats that we've got, so these are the 2013 stats, we can sort of see what's happening in this group. So the Māori population is the light blue line, and, we're 10 years on now. So what that might look like is quite different from 10 years ago. But we can see, obviously, the age around 55 plus is where we see sort of the greatest dip in decline. So if we think about what was happening sort of 55 to 60 years ago, 65 to 70 years ago now, since these results are a little bit older, we can start to see our migration patterns, the opportunities that were, the investments that government were making, and really the shift from, communities and iwi being able to be self-sustainable in our regions, right? So there was a massive shift into gaining employment for survival and health and well-being and that kind of thing. And that really had an impact on the normal use of Te Reo Māori that we saw within our community. So, so if we think of this group of people here, Te Reo Māori, they weren't sort of going to night classes. They weren't. These were all people who had learnt Te Reo Māori as their first language. Incidental Māori language use was very common within this group of people. So what we're trying to deal with at this low, I don't know if you can see my little arrow that I'm trying to move around. You might not be. So anyway, I'm moving the arrow around. So what you can see from the 0 to sort of 50 age group is that there was a massive stem in that sort of that decline. So from the 85 plus, we see almost that proportion of speakers halved. And then we think about some of the reasons why that decline was stemmed, and those were all, that stemming came through movements, grassroots movements that were Māori led. So Māori took charge in ensuring that that decline didn't eventuate to continually halving across our population. So these are some stats from the Manuel Te Reo Māori study. So you can find that on the Mātāwai website, free download. And so these stats we asked of over 1,000 respondents at Te Matatini. So you can think about the context of who might be at those types of events. So a cultural event where Te Reo Māori was obviously valued. And so within our participant group, we have, we've broken up where Te Reo Māori is heard. And so for our participants, the marae continues to be a space where Te Reo Māori is used and heard. And, even whether somebody was had high proficiency or low proficiency, these stats kind of mirrored each other. So, relatives, hui, whānau, so all of these social engagements tend to be the places where we hear our language being used. This was slightly different. I haven't got the slide for it, but I'll talk about the results from our non-Māori, where obviously a workplace, but I was, not obviously a high area for non-Māori, but work was definitely somewhere where they saw Te Reo Māori being used. So if we think about, going back to the historical context, when we had the signing of the treaty, we were still the majority population. Te Reo Māori was used across our economic systems, our social systems, our governance systems, our religious activities. So all of these systems were dominated by Te Reo Māori. So non-Māori, in order to engage in these systems, they needed to get on board with Te Reo Māori. And so, as part of the context of colonialism, and this is, by the time that, the settlers arrived in New Zealand with kind of colonizing aspirations, the techniques that had been sort of honed and used in other colonized nations, they'd kind of got it down to a fine art. So they understood that in order to gain economic power, in order to gain governance control and control of our social structures, Te Reo Māori was a real key to unlocking, sort of dominance over the mind. And so this is something that Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a Kenyan author, talks about in his book, Decolonizing the Mind as well. So, I might get us to have a look at this YouTube clip. Actually, I'll just see how much time I've got. But anyway, you can sort of see at a glance, right? So land possession, Māori land holdings. This is us in 1860. This is us in 1939. And you can imagine what today looks like. So what happens when we're no longer able to access our tribal lands? Obviously, there's the lack of connection that or access that we have to our lands, but we also were unable to sort of do things like grow our own food to the scale that we were doing. We were unable to, when we think about all the ways that land had been, how Māori had been depossessed of, our ability to be self-sustaining is directly related to land loss. So when we think about the attributions for decline, for language decline, one of the issues that I kind of see sometimes is we don't really have a strong connection between this idea that land is directly, land loss is directly related to language loss. And so this is, a recent report from the Royal Society on Languages in New Zealand. So the attributions made for language loss in Aotearoa, we see diminishing numbers of younger speakers. Yep. We also see public context, education system, but people were a little bit, they kind of need to go one step back and actually see, well, actually this is related to land disposition. So, obviously those, so we had the, I'll just read this quote actually. So Vincent O'Malley, one of our key historians, he talks about the idea that you get the Native Land Court established in 1865, and 2 years later you get the Native Land school system. One strips Māori of their land and the other their language, and we still have the consequences of that today in many ways. So, these things are very much going hand in hand, these processes, when we think about what these native schools had in mind for our people, remembering that we gifted these lands to enable this education system to take place. And they were very much places of assimilation. And so, the person I was just talking about, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he describes this idea that the physical violence of the battlefield was followed by the psychological violence of the classroom, but where the former was visibly brutal, the latter was visibly gentle. And so, when we don't have scars, when we don't have physical representations of that mamae, sometimes it can be really difficult to pinpoint how that looks and, how that manifests. So, we still have leftovers, we still have racism. We still have a preference for monolingualism in New Zealand. And we've seen that, this was last year's take on the Miraka Kirimi, all the different, the ways that people responded to that. So some were positive. So some people wanted to demonstrate their dislike or their disdain towards racism. And so, we actually saw the Miraka Kirimi chocolate bars being sold out. So that actually worked in the favour. So going back to this historical trauma and decolonisation. So this is Kiri Lawson Te Aho. She talks about, she's done a PhD on historical trauma and all the different ways that it impacts on our health and well-being. And so she talks about this idea that with each generation, the source of wounding becomes more difficult to see and name, creating a necessity for decolonisation. The sequel to reclaiming and using historical narratives for healing is using them to further self-determination. The pathway and means by which positive reconstructions precede or follow deconstructions of trauma histories is known except to those who are willing and courageous enough to look for them. So, Kitty has a wealth of knowledge in this area. One of her mentors is a guy called Eduardo Duran. And in his book, so he's a Native American scholar who's done, a lot of work counselling in Native reservations in the States. And one of the activities that he asks his clients to think about is, he gets them to draw a whakapapa sort of tree from the client, and then he asks those people to gift a set of trauma to each of their uri. So the idea behind that kind of that exercise is that if we're able to work through our trauma in this lifetime, we're able to not only heal the future generations, but also the past generations. So, this impacts on Te Reo Māori use in a number of ways. So historical trauma. It also impacts on the attributions for language achievement. So achievement in terms of both successes and failures. So if we think about, the reasons that we give ourselves for why we might be doing well or not so well at an activity, like language learning, then this can, some attributions may be empowering, while others can put us into a state of, not actually feeling that great about our decision. So, the failures or, language failures, those are like the errors that every single second language learner makes. So if you're a second language learner, you're bound to make just normal errors. And so when we make those errors, if we attribute those errors to being based on the fact that, we're culturally sort of insufficient in a way, and so there's a whole nother discourse which we're not going to get through in the next 5 minutes. But if we're starting to make attributions about why we're not able to achieve the language goals that we want to, in ways that are actually unhelpful to ourselves, then this can actually have a negative impact on how long we sustain the behavior of language learning. So if I assume that I'm not good at language learning because, what does that say about my identity as Māori? So there's a lot of discourses around the connection between identity and language. But if I have had no training, if Te Reo Māori is the first second language that I've ever learnt, then that's going to impact on me in different ways as well. So I might not have some just normal strategies for learning a second language because it's the first time that I've ever had to do that activity. So weighing up the cost of an error. So if we think that Te Reo Māori allows us to have an in-group belonging, sense of belonging, if we're not sort of feeling like we're succeeding in our language journey, then that also means that identity can sometimes feel out of reach for a lot of our people. So it's important to me as an educator, at this institution, to think about some of the tools that we can use to equip learners with, the best opportunities that they can do, that they can have to learn Te Reo Māori. So obviously having high expectations that are guided with aroha is really important for us. Having organised teaching, having wāhi rūmaki reo, so that's something that's really important. So having spaces where Te Reo Māori is the only acceptable language for that time period, for that location. Also having positive relationships both with peers and mentors and kaiako and that kind of thing. And then obviously helping to transition outside of the classroom into natural environments of use. And that obviously comes back to the support that's needed from, more of the, government support, to ensure that those environments are available. So understanding the historical context, if our tauira understand that colonialism created the conditions by which, Te Reo Māori was devalued, we lost the ability to, be self-governing, all of these things, it can take away the individual feelings of, I'm just not a good language learner. Well, actually, there were generations of, there are a lot of things that took place in order for you to have to be in a position where you're reclaiming your language and paying for that as well. So, so some of the education related factors obviously continue. Providing these positive feelings of empowerment, rangatiratanga agency over their learning, and also, the connection that we have as learners with our wider community, with, te kohanga reo, with kura kaupapa aiwi, kura kaupapa Māori, te ātārangi and other institutions that have been, going for over 44 years. So te ātārangi, 44 years. Te kohanga reo, which followed that. At the moment, we're seeing a really positive shift in attitudes from the general population towards Te Reo Māori, which is really good for the language. So that creates further demand for Te Reo Māori across different spheres. It also improves the ability for some Māori to have workplaces where Te Reo Māori is used. We can see it more in our communities when Te Reo Māori is upheld by those who have power, who have resources to spend money on something that they think is worthwhile. So we also see a shift in messaging. So some of our messaging that we heard coming through our research participants was that, in order to be a good citizen of Aotearoa, I needed to learn Te Reo Māori. These are positive shifts. But they have also created an unprecedented uptake of Māori language, which creates another set of dynamics. So that's about classroom relationship management, understanding, you know, both parties understanding where each other is at. Demonstration of manaakitanga in those spaces is really important, and that was a call from a lot of our research participants as well. So if tangata tiriti are coming into Māori language spaces, for them to ata haere, so this is a, you know, the concept of you know, treading lightly. This is still a place where identities are being explored, historical violence is being explored. So there's a lot going on for tangata whenua when they are entering into these spaces. And so, you know, that the context of having both parties coming into this collective space requires nurturing and negotiation. So, yeah, and obviously it's political. Like, we can't assume that Te Reo Māori acquisition processes are not political. And so, you know, this is positive to see these stats. So, you know, this is even, you know, within a short time frame from 2016, we see this shift coming in. You know, more people are thinking that it would be a good thing if all Māori you know, spoke Te Reo. It would be a good thing if, you know, Te Reo Māori was a core subject. So that's the one on the left there. So, you know, these were just a couple of stats from the Manuel report from the Manuel study that aren't in that report, but they are here in front of you. So the label down the bottom there, so the yes, no. So the yes is they had high proficiency, and the no is no, they didn't have high proficiency in Te Reo. So what you can see is that on the left here, those that have some Te Reo Māori, can speak Te Reo Māori, they were less likely to experience discrimination in their workplace. But obviously you can imagine the types of, you know, workplaces that those people are engaged in. So obviously if you're working at a kura kaupapa, or if you're working at a kohanga reo, well, you're not going to be discriminated against for using Te Reo Māori. And then on the other side, so those that didn't have Te Reo Māori or weren't competent in Te Reo Māori, they tended to, you know, have kind of higher rates of discrimination experiences. So, you know, whether Te Reo Māori is an essential part of somebody's job means that's, you know, when we think about how we break down the time that we spend in our day, if you're spending 8 hours in a workplace where Te Reo Māori is used, that's 8 hours of contact, that's eight hours of being able to use your language. And that's important for, you know, there's a lot of people who, sorry, I've just seen the time. I'm just going to move on. Okay, anyway, so yeah, it's great if we do have more spaces where we can use Te Reo Māori, including in workplaces. Understanding the historical context is also really important for understanding how we respond to our own learning experiences. So I'm just going to stop there and see if anybody has any questions. Oh yeah, I'll put the clip in sorry, that was just the question to put the clip. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, Charlotte's just asked a question. So the question was, do you see, can you see that question? Can other people see that question? Sorry, I actually can't see that question now. So the question was, do I see like a commodification of Te Reo being used? And if you can sort of read my response to that in He Reo Tuku Iho. So I do talk about some instances where, you know, that commodification is happening. And so that's why I raised that last slide that I actually didn't speak to, but the idea that, you know, if your workplace is benefiting financially from Te Reo Māori, what are you doing to ensure that your Māori staff have access to improving their exposure to Te Reo Māori, their reclamation of Te Reo Māori. Yeah, so that's kind of my response to that. So kia ora. So Andrea, how can we nurture Te Reo Māori in workplaces while we are still learning and aren't fluent? Oh, so there's, I mean, great pātai, Andrea. So there's lots of things that you can do. So obviously, so non-Māori staff and organisations, what you can do is advocate for your Māori staff being able to have opportunities to learn Te Reo Māori first and foremost. And then if there are additional resources that are being made available, seeking out to have opportunities where Te Reo Māori is, perhaps taught collectively. You can also encourage, use of Te Reo Māori within your workplace by, demonstrating that you're a person that's interested in Te Reo Māori, or, you can also be clear about your interests. So you can have those direct conversations with people that indicate that you would like to, be somebody that's a safe person to have Te Reo Māori being spoken. So, okay, so kia ora, Andrea. Kia ora, Kiri. Aku mihi kia koe. Yeah, I think every election there's going to be, I am concerned about some of the trends that may happen should somebody get into power over somebody else. But I suppose the main message is that, ko tātou te iwi Māori tēnei e koke tonu ana. We have faced bigger issues than the potential of a government, a more recent government that's going to be unsupportive of Te Reo Māori. So all of us who are, supportive of Te Reo Māori will continue to be doing so. So what we need from our allies, from, our Pākehā, is to say, call out racism when you see it. Make sure that you have a voice in advocating against racism, particularly that has all racism has an impact on Te Reo Māori. So that's my biggest, encouragement for our treaty partners. So yeah. Kia ora, Tatiana. Kia ora. Yeah, so the protection of our wairua when we're also encouraging tangata tiriti, this is a really important discussion, and I think it's particularly for kaiako. So we have a pretty decent job at creating those ground rules. So coming into a Māori language classroom, day one, those understandings need to be sort of laid out. That the protection of our Māori students is really vital within this revitalisation process. So part of that is also about, making sure that we have kind of a greater set of understanding about these historical issues before our tangata tiriti sort of engage in these very personal sort of spaces. So, when we have that dual kind of like motivation for learning Te Reo Māori, so a lot of tangata whenua are looking for reclamation. We're wanting to reconnect to our people. We're wanting to reconnect to our whenua. And that can be really a different set of goals than if you're wanting to demonstrate citizenship, right? So, I think my main encouragement is to think about, as tangata tiriti, for tangata tiriti, to think about, the ways in which you are coming into this space, being cognizant of what it means to be a good manuhiri in this very sort of treacherous water. So koia, but obviously, there's some other kōrero that I can have about that. So I offer this idea of the 6 T's, Tatiana. So if you're coming into a Reo Māori space, making sure that you are tau within yourself. So tauha, making sure that your breathing is aligned, that you're in contact with your tinana, that you have some connection with your taiao, that you have your taituara, so having support people with you through that journey. Geez, I forget the other two, so I'll have to think about it. But yeah, kei roto I te whakawhaka I tahi whakaaro. Kia ora. Thank you. So Roxanne, kia ora. Can you tell us the name of the book you referenced about decolonising? Yes, I can. So it's this book. Okay, so Decolonising the Mind, the Politics of Language in African Literature. So, ka pai. So Leanne, kia ora. Oh, kia ora. There's about 6 out of, oh, well. Yes, kia ora. Really, really appreciate that kōrero and that context. And I suppose, you know, what Leanne's saying here is, you know, that really hits home. That actually makes me want to cry, but I'm not going to do that in front of, you know, a live audience. But yeah, I think, you know, for all of us as Indigenous peoples who are seeking ways to improve, you know, to maintain what our ancestors gave to us, what our tipuna gave to us. So yeah, I really appreciate that comment, and yeah, kia kaha hoki ki a koe. So Natalie, oh, ngā mihi ki a koe, thank you. Kia pai te rā, kia ora. Decolonising or indigenising, why do you have a preference? Do you have a preference, and why? So, I mean, these things sort of, I mean, one of the challenges with decolonising is obviously the idea that we centre the coloniser in that experience. But with anti-racism, you know, that coloniser needs to acknowledge that process of colonisation. At Te Kawa Māui, you know, in a Māori space, we are thinking about indigenising. So, you know, this is a space where, you know, we are hoping that that those decolonising whakaaro are happening within our treaty partners. And so obviously within ourselves, we are looking at re-indigenising. So we're looking at ways of reintroducing our own practices for ourselves. So thank you, Pam. Kia ora. Kia ora, Catherine. So Catherine doesn't have a dedicated workplace or employer, can't currently afford to do a immersion course, so struggling to find a way. Yeah, so I mean, that's a really good good point. And I mean, I think there are some suggestions. So Delena encourages you to look at the courses through Te Wānanga o Raukawa. So there are some self-directed options that are available. So obviously we have also the Morrison whānau, you know, they've got a whole bunch of resources that you can engage with in self-directed learning. So if, you know, if teacher-directed learning is accessible to you, then making sure that you, engage with the resources that are available to you. So these ones, for instance, they have step-by-step activities you can do for 30 minutes a day. Te Wānanga o Raukawa, they have an online course where you can actually sign up and, you know, Zoom session, you know, your way through with one of our amazing kaiako, Kavana, one of the parents from the kura. So, yeah, I'd encourage you to think about that. Oh, yeah, goodbye. Oh, thanks, Medi. Kia ora. Okay, Jenny Barrett. Tēnā koe. Tika, he taumaha tēnei mai. Te mahi ako. Tika, mauri ora ki a koe. Whai Jenny, ngā mihi. And kia ora, Graham. Thank you. Aku mihi. And, oh, the YouTube clip. Okay, sorry. Just go back and find that. Yeah, we didn't end up having time for that, did we? Okay, type the answer, cafe. Okay, so that looks like us. Ka kite.